Well, those who have been following my research on women leaders, in particular Gen X and millennial women leaders in caregiving professions, and the tendency for scapegoating to occur within those contexts, you'll know that there's an interest that I have in unpacking what's known as the scapegoating mechanism. It's something that I encountered in my previous profession as a Protestant clergywoman and became the focus of my dissertation research on clergywomen who have left active ministry, where typically what happens is a self-differentiated woman leader who has more agency and decision-making power can really threaten dominant narratives of female servanthood and female subservience in historically male-centered work professions that can be faith-based communities or healthcare, education, and it's still quite prevalent today, even though that we may assume that there's been a lot of advances in women's positionality and in leadership spaces. But today I really want to bring something from history to the forefront because it shows some really interesting parallels with today's scapegoating of self-differentiated women leaders. So I'll talk briefly about the Salem Witch Trials and a very fascinating element and thread of this that I discovered during my dissertation research. So I've actually been very interested in the Salem Witch Trials and the history and understanding and unpacking of that in today's age, how it's presented in education, how it's discussed sort of in the public discourse. And there really hasn't been really nuanced developments that have been publicly shared about how this really came to be, this witch hunt phenomenon. But there are really incredible historians and sociologists out there, particularly with a feminist lens, that have been able to really unpack what happened in specifically that colonial era New England, that have really important insight for today's experiences of the scapegoating of self-differentiated women leaders. So for those that are unfamiliar or perhaps haven't looked back at your high school textbooks in a while, the Salem Witch Trials occurred at the end of the 1600s in Colonial Massachusetts in Salem. And during that time, there was sort of a recurrence that had happened in Europe during the Wars of Religion that then kind of were brought across the ocean to New England, and this anxiety that was sort of absorbed by the women who were prosecuted in these cases. But the couple of researchers and historians that I was looking at in my dissertation on scapegoating really brought up some interesting points that I'll share here. So for one, the historian that I have looked at most who covers sort of the gendered elements of the Salem Witch Trials is Karlsen, and she identified some really common threads of the identities of the women that were deemed guilty and eventually that were executed in these trials that had similar traits, and they are as follows. The majority of the women who were accused of witchcraft during this time were daughters of families that didn't have sons, mothers who only had daughters, women with no children, and then wealthier widows who either had no children or they had grown up and they were sort of the inheritance of the property in that family. And that's a key observation, is the line of inheritance. So each of those categories of women did not have male heirs to pass property onto, and that really butted up against the expectations of the day and the social narrative of the day, in which land was passed down between patriarchal generations of men. And so this really resisted and confronted that economic model in ways that were really destabilizing for the community of that time in New England. So there were a lot of social changes during that time, both religion and then economically. There was a shift from the more agrarian society to the beginning of industrialization, and also a shift from kind of communal economy and life to a more individualistic approach to life. And the women that were in these categories of not having male heirs really upset the apple cart, so to speak, in terms of people's anxieties around those shifts of family life, economic life, and social life. And this historian, Karlsen, points out some very stark percentages of the women that were ultimately executed who had these identities. So the women who did not have male heirs represented 64% of the women that were prosecuted, 67% of the women who were found guilty of witchcraft, and 89% of the women who were ultimately executed. Again, these were women that did not have male heirs. And I think this is so telling because so often the narrative around this point in history lifts up such things as the over-sexualization of some of the younger women, the fact that they weren't married, but they were promiscuous, or questions of sort of these healing arts. And interestingly, the women who were considered sort of holistic or magic healers, the term is known as cunning folk, really did not represent a large number of the women who were ultimately prosecuted. But the demographic that was represented were typically women over 40 years old who, again, did not have male heirs and perhaps had more access to inheritance, for example, if they were widowed. So I think this light that's shed on the demographics of the women who were prosecuted, found guilty, or eventually executed really helps us unpack the social dynamics that create that scapegoating mechanism. And this leads into the other sort of philosopher and sociologist that I've worked with a lot on my dissertation. In fact, she was one of the committee members on my dissertation committee, is Martha Reinecke. And she specializes in Renee Girard, the ethno-philosopher who does a lot of work with scapegoating. And so for me, in my look at self-differentiated women leaders and the tendency for them to be scapegoated within historically male-centered work professions relates really strongly to these observations from the Salem Witch Trials, where when there is a shift and a tension and pressures within familial and economic and social systems, oftentimes the most self-differentiated, or the person who is seen as apart from those social norms and social narratives, is seen as the greatest threat. And for the clergy women that I worked with, many of them used language that brought back images of this sort of witch hunt. For example, one of the women said that there was a point in her ministry when she felt like the pitchforks were up. And if you can imagine what that would have felt like, that she was sort of being come after. And another language that was used was people corralling around her or spooling themselves up around her, trying to, quote unquote, get rid of her. And another really powerful phrase was a woman had been accused of a variety of different things related to church finances or miscommunication within the congregation, things that she strongly felt she was not guilty of. She ultimately decided she had to choose which hill to die on. And ultimately, that being the accusations were so strong that she just had to sort of put her hands up and say that, one of those things, yes, I'm guilty of that, whatever. So I think it's really telling when we are able to look at social dynamics, not just as the primary accusations being made, which are oftentimes ungrounded in some of these really intense sort of conflicting narrative situations, but really looking at the overarching narratives that are in competition or that are in play. And I think for women who find themselves in these situations where they are being targeted, they are being accused or bullied or ultimately scapegoated when a larger community around them sort of swells in opposition, there are several things that we can and you can do to alert yourself and others to these dynamics. First of all is, for the extent to which one feels comfortable and has sort of the positional power to do this, to hold a mirror up to some of these dynamics, to be able to say, what are the common threads here among people that are sort of raising these accusations? What are the identities and profiles of the individuals who are feeling so threatened by this particular woman leader? It's also important to redefine the narrative and really lifting up and taking sort of the veil off of those surface level accusations to look at what are the underlying pressures within churches that I look at and that I consult with. It's economic pressures, it's historical pressures of never having had a woman clergy, really changing narratives around the acceptability of healthy boundaries and how women with healthy boundaries are often seen as threatening to a social norm of female compliance and availability, sort of exposing those narratives for what they are as opposed to just being drawn into these surface accusations. And then ultimately, I think it's important for each woman leader in these professional spaces to ask herself whether it's a sustainable context for her to continue to lead. And if there are available options in terms of taking time off and looking for alternative work, or moving to a different department, so to speak, basically getting away from the context where one is perceived as such a threat, that may be a safe decision for someone to make. And again, we each have our own contexts and a sort of financial concerns and family life arrangements to be able to make those career and employment shifts. But when, again, this woman described, when the pitchforks are up, it's a really scary and precarious space for women leaders to be in. And as soon as we recognize the unsustainability of that space, then we can make choices and moves to place ourselves in more safe and equitable places where our work and identity are valued.